Or did you wave to them?
No.
So that they know when to start broadcasting.
Okay.
So,
Right. All right, so this is the Friday Portland State University Transportation Seminar. My name is Jenny Liu. I'm one of the faculty members running this seminar along with Dr. Chris Monsieur back there. And today we're very happy to have one of our own civil engineering faculty, Dr. Kelly Clifton, here to talk about consumer behavior and travel choices. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Kelly.
great. Thanks, Jenny. You can take that. Well, thanks for coming, everyone. It's hard to compete with the weather outside, I know, so it's always good to see a full room on a Friday. The title is advertised as the economic impacts of bikes, and I don't want to scare anyone. We are still talking about bikes today. But I think that the study is focused more broadly on all modes and probably more focused on how much people are spending and how frequently they go to different destinations than broad economic impacts. So, and while I'm the one that's speaking today, I had several co-authors that helped put together the study and report. So Christopher Moose, Tomas Morrissey, and Christina Currens, who are all graduate students in civil engineering. So in the last several years, we've been seeing cities all over the country make increased investments in non-auto infrastructure. So we see a lot of places investing in streetcars, a lot of bike lanes and bike infrastructure being put in places around the country. Like New York City's made some incredible changes to their urban environment to accommodate pedestrians and cyclists, as is Chicago and Washington, D.C. And for a long time, the interest in research was really understanding how changes in infrastructure and how changes in land use would result in changes in demand. Are we going to see people using this infrastructure if we build denser, more mixed-use cities with different transportation options? And there's a long body of research in that that's trying to sort of answer that question. And I think while the jury's still out, there's a lot more information on which to base some of our policy decisions. But there are many fewer studies that are taking a look to see what shifts in mode, how they would impact local businesses. So what are the connections with consumer patronage, consumer spending on these local business communities? And so with that, we kind of want to know what are the results, what are the payoffs or anticipated returns, not just for residents, but for our business owners, and how might these changes in mode affect the local business community. So we are attempting to look at just a very narrow piece of this question. So obviously business impacts are broader than just how much people are spending and how they're arriving at that destination. But our goals in this study were to take a look specifically to quantify how people are arriving at specific establishments for a range of different business types. What are the associations between how people are arriving at those establishments and the mode shares we're seeing there with the surrounding environment? So how much do different types of bike or pedestrian infrastructure seem to matter? And then also come up with a quantitative means to look at consumer spending and frequency of patronage by mode, both in descriptive statistics and with some models. So the study took place, I guess we started data collection 2 summers ago here in the Portland metro area, so not just the Portland city center, but all over the metro region. And we looked at almost 90 businesses and across 4 different business types. So we looked at convenience stores that didn't have gas, didn't sell gas. We looked at what we called high turnover sit-down restaurants. And so those are specifically, we looked at pizza and Mexican restaurants, and so those are like Cha-Cha-Cha and Porcano and Pizzicato and those kinds of restaurants. So not really fine dining, but not necessarily fast food with a drive-through either. We looked at drinking places, so bars and taverns, they often sell food too, but known more for the beverages. And then we looked at a local supermarket chain. And so if you think about these different types of businesses, they all have, I guess we didn't realize this till after the study, but they all have something to do with food and drink, which might reflect my own personal interests a little bit. But there's different modal considerations with each of these. So if you're going to the grocery store, you're typically buying something to carry away. And so there's a burden that, you know, in terms of you have to think about if I'm going to take transit or walk or bike, I have to carry all those purchases home with me. But if you're going to a bar or a restaurant, you're carrying your purchases home in your belly usually, right? So you're consuming what you buy there on site. And so each of these have a little bit of a different impact on how you would think about how you would get there. So this is a map of showing all the locations where we surveyed. And so you can see the different business types here in color and in symbols. So the point here is that, again, we picked a variety of different environments in which to survey across these different types. And it wasn't just sort of cherry picking the best places for cycling or the best places for transit. So to collect the data, we intercepted people as they were leaving these establishments. So we asked them if they would complete a quick survey, asking a set of questions, and we used a Samsung tablet, one, because it was sort of compelling, and two, because it sort of made it a lot faster for us to conduct the survey. So it's kind of a cool experiment, and we were able to have some mapping interfaces there with the tablet. And so we had two different types of designs for data collection, one for convenience stores, bars, and restaurants. And so we asked, on the tablet survey, we asked 9 different questions about how they got there, what travel modes did they use, how much did they spend on that visit that day, how often do they patronize that specific establishment, their gender, their home location, their work location, where they were coming from and going to on that particular trip. We asked a set of questions about their attitudes, about is it easy to park here, is bike parking convenient, do you feel safe walking here? So we had a set of attitudinal questions about each mode, which I'm not going to talk about today, and then some other demographic information. And then when people said, no, I don't have time for you, we said, can we just quickly ask you 1 through 5, just as a means to sort of up our response rate. And so for these locations, we were looking at Monday through Thursday only, and for the evening peak, so between 5 and 7 p.m. And this was May through October, and we didn't collect any surveys during bad weather, and that was not, again, to sort of juke the data, but really because we had a limited number of establishments and a limited number of surveys, and we didn't want to have to control for weather in any of our statistical analysis. So in some sense, these are best case scenarios for Portland conditions in terms of what we might see for mode shares. For supermarkets, we also were intercepting people as they were leaving, but because of our arrangement with the firm, they didn't want us to ask as many questions or as many demographic questions, so we just had these very short 5 responses. But for this survey, we had many, many more survey respondents. So the survey took place for an entire week, so Monday through Sunday, from 10 to 8 p.m., and it was 1 week in April of last year. And we sampled about 10% of the customers across 11 stores. So we had a very big sample from which to work with for this. So it's a little bit confusing as I talk about these studies because sometimes there are these 2 different methods. We tried to pool the data where we could, but sometimes I'm going to present stuff just for supermarkets because it was collected a little differently than the others. So first of all, we see big differences if we're looking at the different business types. We see differences in the mode shares of our respondents. So supermarkets, overwhelmingly, people are arriving by car. That's not necessarily a big surprise. So again, if you're buying your groceries, you have to carry those home. But if we look at bars and restaurants, for example, we see a lot more variation and a lot more mode used by alternative modes. So cyclists are shown here in orange. they have the highest constituency there for cyclists going to bars. I don't know what that says about cyclists. But high turnover restaurants too. We also see a high patronage from cars, but a fair number of people for restaurants and convenience stores coming by other modes. So lots of variation, and we can talk about, what are the reasons for that variation here in a minute. So if we wanted to look at this spatially, so how do these, I know this is maybe hard to see with any resolution, but that last slide was just aggregating by business type. Now we want to see, well, what difference does it make if you're in the suburbs versus the central city, or by different business types? We see that there's an enormous amount of variation at any specific individual establishment. So that in some places, if you're in closer in Portland, you're not seeing the automobile as dominant as you would see out in the suburbs. But even as we get out of the central city, we see some locations have, for me at least, a surprising number of people arriving by other modes besides the automobile. So one of the things that we were able to look at was how far were people willing to travel by mode. And again, we see really significant differences here by mode. And I would say the only one that I think is a bit surprising is that transit users are coming the farthest to patronize these establishments. And I guess the other surprising finding is that for pedestrians, we're seeing an average of about 0.7 miles per trip. And if you think about the rules of thumb that we tend to use for pedestrian planning, it's a quarter-mile rule is often what is put out there. And so we're seeing people in Portland, at least on average, walking a lot farther than that quarter mile. So it sort of begs the question if maybe we need to rethink these rules of thumb. And maybe it also says something about our walking environment, that people are willing to walk farther because it's pleasant and accommodating. So here we have some descriptive statistics about how much people are spending on average on that visit by the type of business and by mode. And I think, can I use this pointer? Yeah. Okay. So for supermarkets, we're seeing people spend right around $68 or $67 per visit. And significantly less here spent by people who come for other modes. So again, you're carrying those groceries home, you're going to perhaps spend less than people who are driving. But then these modal differences aren't, the car doesn't show a greater spending per visit for these other types of establishments. So when we remove that carrying constraint, the trend doesn't necessarily hold. So restaurants, we are seeing people who arrive by car spend on average a little bit more. Drinking establishments, pedestrians are spending a bit more, and convenience stores, it's all around $8 or so, but cyclists are spending a bit more. So again, these are just averages across all those businesses, across all those spatial locations here in Portland, but interesting differences. Now, one of the questions we ask is, how often do you patronize this particular establishment each month? So here we start to see some different trends start to emerge. So for supermarkets, those auto users aren't going as frequently, presumably because they can buy more in any given trip. But pedestrians are going to the supermarket 13 times a month compared to about 8 times a month for people who drive. Cyclists, too, are going about 9 times a month compared to about 8 times a month. So they're going more frequently. But interestingly, when we start to look at these other modes, again, where carrying capacity isn't an issue, we're seeing that auto users are going less frequently there. And that doesn't necessarily make sense from a carrying capacity issue, right? So why is it that we're seeing people who walk, drive, and take transit go more frequently to these establishments? So if any of you have heard of Joe Courtwright, he has this theory about Portland called the green dividend, that people who are using alternative modes have more money in their pocket because they're spending less on their transportation. Or we're spending less even if we are driving because we tend to have shorter trip lengths than other places in the country. So this doesn't really confirm his hypothesis, but it is one idea about why we might be going more frequently. Another idea about why we may be going more frequently is the way I asked the question, which is how often are you patronizing this establishment? So it may very well be that if you're walking, driving, or walking, biking, and taking transit, you are going to the same places. You're patronizing your neighborhood locations, places near your home. And if you're driving, you might be eating out or going to bars or going to convenience stores just as often. We have a wider range of destinations that you're going to, and you're just not going to that specific one as often. So I can't answer either of these sort of competing explanations with my study, but it is something to think about as we interpret the results here. So this chart shows the average spending that people made per visit times what they reported for their frequency, and it shows that some of those differences then start to wash out. And while people who drive are still spending more per month at supermarkets, when we look at some of these other establishments, we see that the non-auto patrons are spending more than people who are driving per month. So again, thinking about what's the right explanation for these differences over the course of the month. I can't tell you, but you can think about it, and hopefully we'll have more studies to help inform this question. Okay, so what I've presented so far are just descriptive statistics, so looking at averages over business type or by mode. What we want to do is to do some modeling to control for all the other things that we think are really important. So what are the things that are influencing people's mode shares at these different establishments, specifically in terms of the built environment? What are the other things associated with spending? So it's not just how you get there, but presumably your income, how many people in your family, how many people are in your group that day, and so on. And so we need to control for these other factors that are going to get masked by these descriptive statistics I just showed you. So the first model is a model of trying to explain the differences across each establishment for people who are not driving, essentially. So what explains the non-automobile mode share at each establishment? And so the first thing that we see is supermarkets make a big difference. So you are 15% less likely to walk, bike, or take transit to a supermarket than driving. So supermarkets, again, I think because of this, you're buying goods and carrying them home. Density makes a big difference, too. If you have single-family, the more single-family detached homes we have, the less likely people are to walk, bike, and take transit. Again, presumably that's correlated with lower densities, right? The more multifamily, the more apartment buildings, the higher density, the more likely we would see people taking alternative modes. If the establishment is in a shopping center, so a shopping center with a big parking lot with a number of different sites, you're also more likely to drive. So again, sort of thinking about how that establishment location and its site and the urban design around that site accommodates the car versus other modes. So it made an enormous amount of difference. Now again, this is also sort of picking up the sites and locations where some of these businesses are. If you think about going to a supermarket in the suburbs, some of those are located with these very big parking lots, or if you think about these restaurants like Pizzicato, same thing. In terms of alternative mode infrastructure, the more low-stress bikeways you have within a half mile of that business, we see about a 7% increase, or sorry, 4% increase in the non-auto mode share. And if you are, the farther you are from a light rail station, the less likely you are to take a non-auto mode. If there's no parking lot, so there's a few businesses that are located downtown or in neighborhoods where there's no parking lot in front of the establishment, much is associated with a much higher non-auto mode share. So again, it's not rocket science, it's intuitive, but it's sort of teasing out what is it that we're seeing here at these different businesses and what seems to make what seems to matter most. If we want to look specifically at biking, again, I don't know what this says about cyclists, but if it's a bar, we see about 11% greater likelihood that people are going to bike versus take other modes. We use this measure of intersection density, and it's sort of really a proxy for a lot of things. But in a location, the more intersections you have, typically it means the smaller blocks you have, the more densely the area is developed, often the more mixed use, so residents and retail closer together. So the greater the intersection density, we see about a 1 or 2% correlation with greater bike mode share. If you have bike facilities, and we call these high traffic bike facilities, what I mean by high traffic is if it's on an arterial, so there's a lot of vehicular volumes on that bike facility. So not necessarily the most pleasant biking environment, you're going to see a decline in the number of people that are biking there. So even if we have that facility, those facilities are interacting with what else is going on in the environment in terms of congestion and speeds and volumes of vehicular traffic. Having a bike corral within 200 feet of the establishment makes a big difference as well. Now again, if you know anything about the policy in Portland about putting in bike corrals, they come at the request of the business. So this doesn't necessarily mean that if you put in a bike corral, you're going to see a 7% increase in bicycle traffic, but it does mean that those businesses are seeing a large number of cyclists, and so therefore want this infrastructure. And then for every bike parking spot, or every 10 bike parking spots that you have in front of that establishment, you get about a 0.5% increase in bike cyclists arriving at your site. So clearly it makes a difference in terms of what are the kinds of things we're investing in near these different establishments, where are they located, what are the transportation conditions around these businesses. Okay, so now we did a bunch of models about how much did people spend. So how much did they spend that specific trip, and we did different models for different business types. So restaurants and bars, if the more children you have, the less you're going to spend. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that children are with you on the visit. It just means sort of the larger your family, the less you're going to spend. So there's a couple ways you might interpret that. If you have kids at home, maybe you have less discretionary resources for eating out and dining. It might mean that you're spending less time, so you have to get home, so you're not going to have that dessert, or you're not going to stay for another drink because you have to be home. Anyway, in terms of household income, it didn't have as much of an impact as we thought it would have. So for every $10,000 increase in additional income at the household level, we're only seeing a 1% increase in spending. So a little bit different than we expected. I thought it would have a much stronger impact in the models. For every minute you spend in one of these places, you spend about 0.5% more. So maybe these people with children know something that the rest of us don't. But this is intuitive. The larger people in your group, the more you're going to spend. So if you're bringing those family with you or you're eating with others, you're more likely to spend more. And then this is what I call the margarita effect. If it's a Mexican restaurant, you're going to spend about 6% more than you would on a pizza place or in a bar. So similar thing, but with convenience stores. So men spend less at convenience stores than women per trip, which I don't understand that at all. I thought it would be the opposite. But people aged 25 to 34 spend about 12% more than everybody else in the population, so that makes some sense to me, I think. The more adults you have in the household, the more you're going to spend, so about 4% more than everybody else. Again, the longer you spend in a convenience store, the more you're going to spend, so don't dally. The more people that are with you, the more you're going to spend. So this is like you need to buy a case of beer, I guess, instead of a 6-pack. The more often that you go, the more you spend. So probably if you're relying on this convenience store for more regular shopping for your household, you're probably buying more things. But if you only go a few times a week, you actually spend quite a bit more than people who go weekly. So anyway, we just wanted to control for all of the different things that would explain how much they spend. So if you see about this model and this model, what's missing is there's no mention of mode. So when we put mode in these models, it had absolutely no effect once we controlled for income and controlled for household size and controlled for gender. So all of those differences you saw in those descriptive statistics are really masking sort of the underlying characteristics of who are cyclists and who are pedestrians and who are the people that are driving. So on one hand, there are differences by mode, but it's more about the demographics of those mode users, if that makes sense. So that's still a positive finding in terms of thinking about this, because what it means is it really doesn't matter how you get there in terms of your spending in that store, that the mode itself isn't the driver. Okay, supermarkets, really complicated. We had a lot of data, so we had the flexibility of looking at a lot more things in these models. Specific to transportation, though, in these models, transportation made a difference. So we saw this in the descriptive statistics as well. But even when we controlled for those demographic characteristics, mode made a big difference. So if you're walking, biking, or taking transit, you're spending less than those people who are driving to the grocery store. Again, that makes intuitive sense, thinking about carrying goods. But this is on top of any differences we see by gender, by race and ethnicity, and so on. So we also had the ability to look at how far the store was from home and how long the trip distance was. So the longer the trip distance, the less people are going to spend by these modes, and that makes sense too. So if I have to go a long distance by bike or walking, I'm going to spend even less than if I have a short distance by walking and biking. Okay. So I think what's interesting about this, and I think there's a lot more we can talk about it, and I'm hoping you guys have questions that we can participate in sort of a robust discussion here. But in terms of mode choices, we know and can see from the results here that the environment matters. So where these businesses are is situated in the region, how densely the areas are around them, whether they have the right infrastructure to support other modes, makes a difference in how people are arriving at those destinations. And that's confirmed by other studies. This really isn't anything specifically unique to my study. We also saw the differences by business type. So capacity to haul goods is really important. But also, if you're going to the nature of the business, if you're going to restaurants, or you're bringing along your family, or you're buying goods for your family, it makes a difference in terms of the mode that you're going to choose. But the biggest thing is really that the drivers here tend to be more on the socioeconomic side in terms of key differences between the mode users. So it seems to suggest that people who bike, walk, take transit, and drive, that there are key socioeconomic drivers to those decisions. In terms of the consumer behavior, though, there's not a lot of evidence out there, like I said. I think concurrent with my study, there were two others. So there was one in New York and one in Australia looking at similar things. But there really isn't a lot of background to sort of guide our thinking in terms of what we might expect here. Clearly, we saw very distinct differences on people's spending amounts by their mode of transportation. We also saw very clear differences in their frequency of visits. So non-auto patrons tend to go to these establishments more often, all of these establishments more often. And that results in a different spending pattern per month. So even though we're seeing that in the case of supermarkets, people who drive are spending more, some of that difference is compensated for by the end of the month by the fact that people are going more often. So that frequency is sort of a key thing here to thinking about what are the returns on investments. The models are demonstrating that demographics are the drivers of spending, though. So the fact that mode was only significant in the supermarket model means that it's not mode itself, but actually who's using those modes that make the difference. And the peak hours differ by mode, and I didn't talk about this, but in the grocery stores, we see that people are making purchases at different times of day. So in the grocery store, in the other surveys for restaurants, bars, and convenience stores, we only surveyed them in the evening peak. But for the grocery stores, we were able to look at a broad spectrum of times of day and days of week. And so we suspect, and our data kind of indicate this, that we're seeing different mode use by different time of day, and I'll talk about that here in a second. So we had a few limitations to our study. So first of all, everyone asked this question, why didn't you look at retail? So these are all food and drink related businesses. Did you just decide to do this so you could go to happy hour after the study? Perhaps, but we were working with a number of different constituents. And the problem with looking at retail is that retail's a very big category. So whether you're looking at buying clothing or you're looking at buying music or books, they all have different price points, and they're sort of difficult to control for and sort of tease out what's going on there. But I do think that if we were going to do this again, we would want to include retail and look at a much broader spectrum of businesses. We do have a limited time frame, so again, these are sort of cherry-picking the best possible conditions for biking and walking in particular. So we're only looking at good weather for some of those businesses, again, only Monday through Thursday evening peak. So it would be more interesting to see what sort of variation we see in the winter, for example. This was a little bit of a unique study in that we intercepted customers at the business. And a lot of times in our transportation surveys, we are asking people to fill out diaries, and we're sort of finding them at their home location. And so having something that merges these two approaches, I think, would give us a much clearer picture about what's going on here. So we were only able to ask them about this one business and this one specific trip. It would be nice to know what else is going on in their day and their trip making throughout the day and throughout the week. And so we don't have that information. In looking at sort of monthly spending, we made some assumptions. So we had to assume that people were going throughout the month by the same mode that we observed them on that one trip, and that they were spending the exact same amount. So we know that that's a limitation when we're looking at those descriptive statistics over the course of the month. And then the last thing is important, because I get this question a lot. Well, the study was done in Portland. How is this going to translate? How are these results going to tell me anything about Omaha, Nebraska, or Houston, Texas? And so I think that's a big question about whether we are unique here in our non-auto mode use and our spending patterns. I think there's another question here. If we think about extrapolating these results even here in Portland into the future, if you think about these 4 bends of cyclists, for example, that we talk about, so sort of the fearless cyclists and then the people who are interested but concerned. If we think that demographics are part of the drivers of spending patterns, then maybe people in these are future cyclists, people that we're trying to entice to cycle by giving them higher level accommodation and infrastructure or better infrastructure, might not be the same, and so therefore might not have the same spending pattern and mode choices for these types of trips. So just a cautionary tale before we think about how this might apply in other places or in other timeframes. So another big consideration I like to think a lot, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about since we've done this study, is just the variation. So again, I just captured people on one specific trip to one specific location. And I like to think about this variation in mode use. So first of all, we tend to be multimodal. So just because I went to Pizzicato one day on foot doesn't mean every time I go there I'm going to be on foot. And so in some sense, dividing people up into these modal bins really isn't a very useful way to think about things, because if you're a cyclist, there are probably a few cyclists out there who only cycle. They refuse to take other modes. There are probably some people out there who only take transit and walk because of an income constraint or physical limitation. And there might be people that only drive. But I would say in general, we tend to be multimodal. So we need to think about this variation and how we capture it in data. So in transportation, we tend to either focus on one location or one day. And so in all of our travel surveys that we often use to project our demand, we're only looking at one day. And people have a huge amount of variation over the course of the week and over the course of the year. And we do a poor job of capturing that. So commensurate with that is spending. So I had to make that assumption that people are spending the same amounts each time. We know that that's not true. Sometimes you only need to grab milk at the grocery store. Sometimes you're buying food for Thanksgiving dinner. So again, thinking about capturing variations in spending, but also how the spending for these kinds of trips fit into your overall household budget and spending on other things. So again, back to Joe Courtwright's hypothesis that we're able to spend more at bars and restaurants in Portland or go more often to bars and restaurants because we spend less on transportation. Is that true? I'd like to have more information on the kinds of things that we spend our money on. And then destination. So again, I asked people, how often did you patronize this establishment? So one theory here, and when we see those differences in frequency, again, it may be that people who are driving are going to more destinations, right? And so they might go to places outside their neighborhood. They might have a broader range of destinations that they visit, but they might go just as often for that trip purpose. And then finally, another thing about transportation is we tend to also focus a lot of our data collection on the morning peak and the evening peak, because that's when we tend to have the most congestion on the roadway. But it may be that if we really want to capture other modes, it may be that if you're biking and walking and taking transit, you're not making those trips during the peak, probably in part to avoid auto congestion. Or maybe you're making those trips from work. So we need to kind of move away from our obsession with just the evening peak and think more broadly. And we have some evidence to show that we might pick up more multimodal users or non-auto users if we look at the distributions by time of day. So this is just a snapshot from Seattle. And it is from their household travel survey. So we looked at the time of day that people were making different types of trips by different modes. So now, admittedly, we have small numbers here in some of these bins. But you see people who are driving sort of dine out 2 different times a day, lunchtime. We see most people using that mode for that trip, and dinner time. But walking, people are more likely to walk for their lunch hour trip. So if we're only capturing people at the peak hour, we're missing these users here. And then cyclists, there's not very many of them in this particular sample. But it just illustrates that maybe we need to think more broadly about times of day. And then this was for shopping trips. So, I think there was something else interesting here. Oh, we don't have it on here. Never mind. On another graphic, I had transit. And transit users are more likely to eat out in the morning. So I think it's like grabbing a cup of coffee while they're waiting on the bus. But that's for another study. Okay, so what's the takeaway here? So first of all, in our study, like in many studies, automobile is still the dominant mode of transportation. So across all those land use types, we're still seeing that the majority of trips are made by automobile. But as you could see by that map, there was huge variation in specific establishments, right? So we need to think more about if that's a desired social goal to have people use non-automobile modes, then how do we get people to do that? These non-auto users are competitive consumers. So if you've read any of the press coverage of this study, they're saying, cyclists are better spenders. Well, I think the way to interpret this is that they're competitive. So in some sense, it doesn't really, at least there's some evidence to suggest to these business owners that that there's commensurate study that these users are coming frequently and in many cases spending just as much as people who are driving. There's important differences in frequency by how people are arriving there, and I think that even if they're spending less, that's a really important marketing opportunity. So again, if you're a grocery store and you know people who are walking are coming in your store 13 times a month, they are your regulars, right? Then so you might think about opportunities for marketing to those consumers or having these customer loyalty programs that you want to capture them because they are coming back. Back to this question about variety and destinations. So again, these trade-offs in frequency versus location. So it may be that those people who walk and bike are patronizing their neighborhood businesses, and therefore, because they're going back again more often, they're really vital to keeping those businesses going and supporting those businesses in their neighborhood. But people who are driving are going to a lot of different places. So in terms of economic development, it's not that one is better than the other, but in terms of accommodating them and where they're coming from in terms of market base, I think it's important things to think about. So, and then just lastly, this is the first of this kind of study. It's certainly not the last. So we have a lot more questions. A lot of limitations in this study need to be addressed before we fully understand what's going on here. So I'm hoping that we see more activity in this area and certainly lots of room for a lot of thesis or dissertation topics here. So I'd like to thank all the businesses that supported us in our data collection and the large number of students that were involved in this effort. So we had a very big data collection team working for us, and some of you here in the room were participating in that. And we also had a large number of people sponsoring us. So OTREC gave us a generous grant, and we had a variety of other people also providing support and funding. So, questions?
Health perspective, and I think there's a lot of work that's been done around getting people to shop at grocery stores versus those smaller little corner stores like 7-Eleven,
yeah.
Convenience stores, yeah. And also there's a lot of work that's been done to get people using active transportation, and so it seems like your study is saying, well, they're not as compatible as we would hope that they would be, and so how do you recommend tackling both of those things simultaneously?
So it's not as compatible going to the grocery store by non-auto modes. Well, I do think, and I don't know if I have it on the slide, but we still have a fair number of people going to supermarkets. So 11% of our sample were going to supermarkets by non-auto modes. I think it's a difficult thing. Because you do have to carry, and especially if we're talking about people with limited incomes shopping at grocery stores versus convenience stores. They get more for their money at a grocery store and more variety. But the hauling capacity is definitely a barrier. So one thing that stores could do is offer delivery service. So we still like to go and sort of squeeze the Charmin, so to speak, and sort of pick out what you want. But if you could then leave your bags and come back later, or leave your bags and have someone deliver it to your home, that would sort of facilitate arriving or shopping by other modes. So I shop by foot at my local grocery store, and I know there have been a few times where I've bought more things than I can actually carry home. And so, you know, if there were some kind of service like that, I think that would greatly help. Also, this topic about shopping at supermarkets versus convenience stores was something I looked at a very long time ago in my dissertation, and in Austin, Texas. And so there, the public transit agency offered what they called the grocery bus. And so it was a small circular that went around in the neighborhoods and just went to the local grocery stores, and that also helped with that problem. So I think there's also, you know, we can be creative here, and particularly importantly, and more people are creative, thinking about different rideshare options too. So maybe I can walk or take transit to my grocery store, but then get a ride home with somebody who's sort of that has capacity in their vehicle. So I think there's lots of ways to think about facilitating more non-auto use through their grocery stores.
So I've got kind of a two-part question. I was curious just how difficult it was to recruit businesses, because it seems to me like it would be not too bad since you're essentially doing market research for them. But then also I'm wondering, after you've made your conclusions and had your findings, what their level of interest has been in those, and if you've had conversations with some of the business owners who participated, and if they're planning on doing anything with this information. Or
Yeah,
like
absolutely. So, yeah, so we had a very difficult time specifically on the grocery store and getting national chains to participate. And so it's just very easy for them to say no because their office is in California or Chicago. And so we weren't able to sort of engage a broad variety of those national chains like we would have liked to, and Trader Joe's as well. However, we had really strong partnerships from local franchises and local chains, and so that helped a lot. So, for example, the convenience stores in our study were all plaid pantries, and they have been incredibly receptive. So, one of the things that Plaid Pantry has done since this has been more aggressive about putting in bike racks at their stores. So, they were really receptive to the fact that cyclists are spending more than other users, and have been strategically accelerating bike racks there. The supermarkets as well, so they are going to allow us to continue to do this study, and they're very interested in it. So for the restaurants and bars, it was kind of a mixed bag. So.
A question from Melissa online. She asked, on the slide that showed the distance traveled by mode, did the transit distance represent the distance that the rider actually rode, or the shortest route, or as the crow flies distance, because the bus doesn't always take a direct route?
It represented the network distance from their origin to that establishment. And I believe that we used the distance that the transit actually took. And we had to make some assumptions about shortest path connecting to that transit, but we tried as best we could to measure what the user was experiencing.
I had a question related to your site selection, specifically with the supermarkets. Mm-hmm. You kind of hinted at this a little bit with the negative correlation with shopping centers for non-auto modes, but I wondered if, with you or your colleagues, notice any differences in the design or layouts of different supermarkets, whereas maybe some markets located in a city center a little more in line with the local architecture versus the suburban style supermarkets, if there was any strong differences that you noticed.
Yeah, that's a great point. So some of the stores, so if you think about Safeway in Hawthorne just redid their store, and the Fred Meyer on Hawthorne as well, where they have the design oriented. So if you're a pedestrian, you can enter right there from the sidewalk, and then cars enter from the back, and presumably that, in theory, is making it easier to accommodate those different modes. And so we didn't do any statistical analysis because we just didn't have enough grocery stores. We had 11 in our sample. I think that's sort of next on our to-do list, is to look at it more qualitatively to see what those differences might be. But it's kind of hard to tease that out from the larger context in which they're situated. So if you think about that Safeway, the Safeways that are downtown, for example, there's one in the Pearl and one over here on 10th. Part of the reason that they're designed that way is where they're located in the urban context. So we're hoping to do some follow-up studies with a group in California that has sort of tried to look at this issue, and a colleague at the University of Oregon, Nico Larco, who spent a lot of time looking at the urban design piece.
I'm wondering about the sample method. So how did you, the sample, is it evenly distributed about the location?
The survey respondents?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so the individuals, so we first made selection of sites and locations and businesses where we were collecting the data. And then with the intercept survey, we were basically just intercepting them as they left. So there wasn't necessarily a strategy involved, like we were going to sample every fifth customer. But I would say that there is some unevenness across the locations in terms of survey respondents by specific establishment. So when we did models of, so what I didn't show here today, the spending models are at the individual level. The models of mode share are at the establishment level. So it does come into play a little bit.
I wanted to go back to when you briefly touched on the average walking distance being 0.7 versus sort of the rule of thumb we use. Did you break that out by the average distance according to what type of establishment they were going to, like whether people walked further to go to a bar than they would a grocery store? And then secondly, did you see differences amongst whether they were sort of closer to the central business district, whether people were walking shorter distances in central city versus further away, they were forced to sort of walk further to get to their neighborhood destinations?
Yeah, great question. And I believe we did the first thing, so looking at distance by establishment type, and unfortunately I can't remember, but I think it's in the report. And then average trip distance by location, we haven't looked at that yet, but that's a great point. So is walking farther an artifice of not having as many options or destinations, or is it a function of the fact that people are enjoying walking farther?
Are there any other questions?
I just had a question more on the supermarkets. If I understand right, did you work with New Seasons mostly? And just thinking about the customer that goes to New Seasons could be significantly different than
Absolutely.
someone who goes to Albertsons or Fred
Right.
Meyer, maybe. To try to separate any of those differences.
Yeah, so we aren't able to look at that, but it would be interesting to look at. First of all, they have a slightly different sort of market demographic and market culture, although when you look at their more suburban stores versus the stores in the central city, the auto mode shares are much higher. So the interesting thing would be to compare similarly situated stores, a more conventional supermarket with a New Seasons store, say on Hawthorne, but we weren't able to do that.
So you talked about one of the things that needs to happen is we need to look at how we're multimodal and that there are some challenges in that. Can you discuss maybe what needs to happen to start looking at this kind of stuff in a multimodal way, or if there are efforts out there that are doing that?
Yeah, so just descriptively, one of the things that we did, and I think Patrick helped do that analysis on the OHAS data, was just sort of identify people, for example, that have made one cycling trip, right, at least one. And then look at all the other modes that they might use over the course of the day. And so I think, there's an interest, I have an interest in looking at sort of mode variation as well as mode substitution. So if you want me to change modes, if you want me to start biking more to work, how does that play into it? Or if you do bike to work, are you able to bike every day? And if so, what are the reasons why? Because your destination's not changing, so the other conditions might change. The weather might change, the activities you need to do might change, the trips that you're making before and after work might change. And so I think all of that requires us to collect data for longer than one point in time, one day in time. So if I go to if someone who's biking to the grocery store, are they biking there all the time? Probably not. And they're probably using a variety of different stores to meet their food shopping needs. So thinking about this variation, I think, is important, because when we talk about this from a policy standpoint, we're probably still going to need to, as much as we would like to think about shifting away from the automobile, it's still a really important part of our mobility. And so thinking about those conditions that are sort of primed for people to shift, what are those conditions? And they're not all just environmental. So if you think about safe routes to school, which is another whole other policy direction, there's a lot of reasons why kids walk to school don't walk to school just beyond the physical environment. So how do we sort of think about those things, and so about like sort of the question back there about, why aren't people how do we get people to walk and patronize their grocery stores over convenience stores? Well, there's a whole other set of conditions that are going on there. And so it's not just about putting in more bike lanes.
I've heard you mention a couple times the follow-up studies. I was just curious about if you were going to sort of expand or focus more precisely what the follow-up studies might capture.
So I don't have anything in the works just yet in terms of this specific study. If I were going to do it over again, well, there is a follow-up study with New Seasons, and we would like to sort of tease out this variation question a little bit more. So when we ask them, how often do you come here, we would also like to know, how often do you use this mode to come here? So just to be able to refine some of these estimates a little more.
All right, so is there one more question?
Kind of using my own personal tendency to go to a bar or restaurant on a Friday or a Saturday, do you think you would have seen kind of a drastic difference in the results, surveying some of the people going to bars and restaurants, and if you can kind of expand on that?
Yeah, so I think there was definitely a limitation looking at 5 to 7 p.m. And part of the reason we did that is that this study, we're sort of pooling resources with another study that wanted to look at that peak hour. And so I think we would have seen greater numbers of people. I'm not entirely sure that the modes may have changed. So it may be that the spending amounts would be different. But yeah, people stay longer for happy hour on Friday than on Thursday. So another shortcoming of the study for sure.
Thank you, Dr. Clifton, for excellent talk.
Thanks.